preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Thank you and good evening. I've been looking forward to this evening's talk ever since I was first invited to give it because of the very special place that the 92nd Street Y is, because of the wonderful programming they have here at all times. I didn't realize I'd be competing with this cardio court that makes you look slimmer and healthier while watching television, but I will try and make good use of the time we have. And then I got even more excited last week when I was watching President Clinton's State of the Union address, and all these dignitaries are brought in, and the band is playing Hail to the Chief, and he's introduced so specially. And I said to myself, if that's the way they introduce somebody who's giving the state of one country, what are they going to do with me when I talk about the state of the entire world? So I was eager to come and see how I'd be received and how I'd be introduced and what dignitaries would turn out. And I look at the list of people who have given this address in the past, and it's part of me is honored to be in that company, to have my name added to that list. And part of me says, well, it took them long enough to get around to me. They used up every other speaker in the national Jewish scene. They're really scraping the bottom of the barrel this year. What is the state of world Jewry? My wife and I were in Israel for the Sukkot festival last October, and there was a story going around which pretty well captures how I'm feeling tonight. It's the story of the man who asks his neighbor, would you say you're an optimist or a pessimist about the peace process? And the neighbor says, me, I'm an optimist. So the man says, then how come you look so tense? And the neighbor says, you think it's easy being an optimist? I'm an optimist about the state of world Jewry, and it's not easy. Everywhere I look, there are causes for concern. Things which were once sources of strength are now sources of grave concern. I remember when I was first starting out in the rabbinate, my very first pulpit after I'd finished my military obligation was in the New York area at Temple Israel of Great Neck. And the clergy, the Jewish and Christian clergy of the various churches and synagogues of Great Neck would gather once a month for a meeting and share some mutual concerns. And we'd brown bag our lunch, and I remember we'd sit around and I would listen to the Christian ministers in Great Neck talk about some of the problems they have. And they would talk about the rising divorce rate in their families, and I would say, boy, I'm glad I don't have that problem. It doesn't happen in Jewish families. And they'd talk about spousal abuse, husbands being physically abusive of their wives. They would talk about alcoholism and drug use, and I'd say, hey, it doesn't happen in our members. They talk about interfaith marriages, young girls who had grown up in a Catholic parochial school and married a non-Catholic. And I'd say, boy, it's a good thing the Jewish intermarriage rate is only about 7 or 8%. That's one thing I don't have to worry about. Not that many years later, we have caught up with the rest of the United States. And the strength of the Jewish family, which was once a pillar of Jewish identity and Jewish community, no longer operates that way. There was a time when whatever else Jews believed or didn't believe, they were united by their devotion to Israel. It was the one thing we all had in common, and by the shared pain of the Holocaust. And yet a new generation has come of age that doesn't remember the Holocaust. It's a chapter in the history books. A generation for whom Israel has always been on the scene and is no longer the darling of American liberals. The things which used to automatically unite us don't work anymore. My first source of concern is the growing separation between American Jews and Jews in Israel. There was a time when it was much easier. We were the descendants of East European Jews. They were the descendants of East European Jews. We lived in this hemisphere, they lived in another one, but we felt we were the same people. There was a time when our division of responsibility was abundantly clear. They would be heroes for us, and we would pay the bills. We would be so thrilled by the way the Israelis were fashioning a new image of what it meant to be a Jew. To be a Jew was now Paul Newman as Ari Ben Canaan rather than Woody Allen. And we were willing to pay them to reshape the Jewish image. Things changed. We no longer have the same needs. They no longer need the handouts. We've grown and they have grown, and alas, it looks like we have grown apart. On the part of American Jews, there is no longer that automatic connection to Israel. On the part of Israeli Jews, there's no longer the sense that they and we belong to the same people. Are we still one, or is that an outdated slogan of the Jewish communal fundraising apparatus? There is a passage in the Talmud, which when we studied it in seminary, we thought was a big joke. Really, we made fun of it, we parodied it, but as I look at the American-Israeli situation, it comes to mind. At one point in the Talmud, the rabbis asked the question, what is the halachic status of Siamese twins? A person with two heads but a single body. Do you have to put tefillin on both heads? We thought this was a real scream. If this Siamese twin combination shows up in the minyan, do you count them as one person or two? And we thought this was really a very funny question. I mean, this is the sort of thing the rabbis get involved in. As I look back on it, I realize whatever you think about the question, their answer was a very interesting answer. You know what the Talmud says? How do you decide, is this creature one person or two? You pour hot water on one of the heads, and if the other one screams, it's one person. To that degree, Jews in America, Jews in Israel are still one people. When they're on hot water, we feel the pain. When something terrible happens in Israel, when Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated, when a suicide bomber blows up a bus, we feel the pain. To that degree, we are a united people. And yet it seems to me we can't stop there. That is such a minimal definition of what it means to be united. What would happen, God forbid, if there stopped being calamities in Israel? Would we share nothing with them if there was no more pain? It seems to me that we have to redefine what our relationship to the other community is. And I would suggest a redefinition along the following lines. Israel can teach us what it's like when it's normal to be Jewish, because American Jews have never had that experience. Being Jewish has always been a subset, a minority, a special case. Members of my congregation in Massachusetts, when they would go to Israel, are surprised at how good they feel. They didn't know what to expect. They thought they'd be moved by the wall. They thought they'd be moved by the places where Jewish history happened. The one thing they're not prepared for is how important it is to them that everybody is Jewish, that the policeman is Jewish, that the fruit peddler is Jewish. They've never had the experience of it being normal to be Jewish. And I think one of the things Israel will do for world Jewry is teach us what is it like to live out a Jewish life without the admixture of a majority Gentile culture. How will Jewish religion evolve? How will Jewish polity evolve? How will Jewish life evolve if being Jewish is permitted to set the terms? And what will we give them in return? I have a rather surprising suggestion. I think the American Jewish community has to teach the Jews of Israel how to be religious. It is, I suspect, a strange claim. We were raised to believe Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah. We were raised to believe that Torah comes forth from Zion, but they're not doing a very good job of it. I think we have to teach the Israelis different ways of being a serious, committed Jew. One of the things that struck me in the aftermath of the Rabin assassination 3 months ago, all the young, secular Israeli Jews, the high school students, lighting candles and singing songs. And what that said to me when I saw it on television was that something profoundly painful had happened to them, something very moving. They wanted to respond to it in ritual, in religious terms, and they didn't know how, because most of the Israeli young people had never been taught how to speak the language of Jewish religion. They had seen religion as something which is monopolized by the Orthodox. They'd examined it and decided it wasn't for them, and they had never seen the alternative. So when something like the Rabin assassination happened, and they needed to express it in religious terms, and they needed to ritualize it, because one of the things we do when we are confronted, when we are assaulted by death, we want ritual to reimpose order on the chaos that death represents, to give us a sense of knowing what is the right thing to do with our feelings. And these young people were stumped, and they had to invent rituals. So they sat around lighting candles and singing songs and feeling only slightly satisfied by it because they didn't know how to respond. We have to teach them. We have to teach them the range of religious responses which are available to a modern Jew. The story of the Jewish people through the 3,000 years of our existence has been an alternation of living in our own land and living as a minority in the diaspora. The Bible is a product of Jews living in their own land. The Talmud, the prayer book, Jewish theology are a product of Jews living in the diaspora. Jewish religion is both. Jewish religion needs to be nourished by both kinds of communities, and it's our task to remind the Jews of Israel of that. My teacher, with a capital T, Mordecai Kaplan, alav hashalom, taught me two great truths. He taught me first that Judaism is more than a religion, it's a religious civilization, a religious peoplehood. I remember the day he proved that to me beyond any doubt. It was the first day of my senior year at rabbinical school. Dr. Kaplan taught a class called Philosophies of Religion. First day of class, he said to everyone, take out a sheet of paper and write down the names of the 10 greatest Jews of the 20th century. Okay, what names do you put down? Einstein, Freud, Herzl, Brandeis, Ben-Gurion, Martin Buber, names like that. When we were done and we'd listed our 10 names, Dr. Kaplan said, all right, next to every name, write the name of the synagogue where he davened every Shabbos. What, Freud went to shul? Einstein? No. Were they Jews? They thought of themselves as Jews. The world saw them as Jews. Rabbinical students thought they were the greatest Jews of the century. But they weren't Jews in a conventional religious sense. They were Jews because they cast their lot with the past, present, and future of the Jewish people. It is an insight I think we have to recapture. There are different ways of being Jewish, and what they all have in common is a sense that you belong to this great people. The second great truth that Dr. Kaplan taught me was that the year 1789 was as traumatic for the Jewish people as the year 70 when the Romans destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem. And just as after the fall of the Temple, we had to reinvent Judaism, reinvent it from being a religion of land and sacrifices, animal offerings, to a religion of portable culture and mitzvot, religious deeds. After 1789, after the advent of democracy, we had to reinvent Judaism again, from a defined community to a voluntary community. Or as one student of Jewish history has said, from a community of dissent to a community of consent. In the 19th and 20th centuries, we faced something unprecedented in Jewish history. People could choose whether or not they wanted to be Jewish. For several hundred years, the book that defined Jewish behavior was the Shulchan Aruch, the book that Orthodox Jews still live their lives by. Shulchan Aruch means a prepared table. Here it is, everything is all set out for you, it tells you what to do. To be a Jew in 1996 is to live not by the Shulchan Aruch, the prepared table, but to live by a buffet line. That's what Jewish life has become. You can choose what you want. You can decide whether or not you want to belong to a synagogue. If you choose to belong, you can choose, will it be an Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Humanist synagogue? When you have chosen, you are further free to choose how much of that synagogue's program do you want to affirm. It's not a Shulchan Aruch, it's not a prepared table, it's a buffet line. And there is nobody with the right to nag you and say you can't have dessert if you don't eat your vegetables. There is no authority to tell us how we shall live out our Jewishness. In the old country, in the pre-modern world, Jews lived observant lives not only because God expected it, but because their neighbors expected it. Human beings, after all, are social creatures. We are very deeply affected by what people think of us. To be a non-observant Jew in the shtetl was a little bit like being a Knicks fan in Orlando. It's not exactly illegal, but people will look strangely at you. And I believe it is harder to be a serious liberal Jew in New York City or in Omaha, Nebraska in 1996 than it was to be an Orthodox Jew in the shtetl in 1896. Because we have so many options, because we are given permission to redefine ourselves. We don't need to live in the same community we were born in. We don't have to follow our parents' occupations. We can even choose what name we want to go by, and we can certainly choose how we want to express ourselves religiously. I think it's false. I think it is terribly misleading to say that people become conservative or Reform Jews because it's easier than being a traditional Orthodox Jew. Fact is, there are still easier options than that. People choose this because this is how they want to express their Judaism. And as a friend of mine says, all this, the division into conservative, Reform, Orthodox, this is obsolete. This is only a matter of alumni associations and letterheads. There are only two kinds of Jews in 1996. There are serious Jews and there are non-serious Jews. And a serious conservative Jew has more in common with a serious Orthodox Jew than he does with a non-serious conservative Jew. And somebody who stays home from an Orthodox synagogue, his lifestyle is indistinguishable from somebody who stays home from a Reform temple. If you're sleeping late, it doesn't make any difference what kind of service you're missing. For 200 years now, the problem of those people who cared about the future of Judaism was to come up with a rationale. Why should people be seriously Jewish? And our tradition was no help, because nobody had ever asked this question before. Nobody had to ask the question, why should I be Jewish? It's like saying, why should I be my parents' child? Why should I be a citizen of the Tsar? Why should I live in this village? This is what you were born into and you lived it out. Suddenly, given the wealth of options which are available to a modern person, we have these choices. And we had to come up with a rationale. And the community no longer had either the theological or the social sanctions that Jews had historically had. Can you see the difference between saying it's not nice to park in a handicapped space and saying if you park here you will be towed and fined? That's the difference between being a Jew in the 20th century and being a Jew in the 18th century. In the pre-modern world, the community had all sorts of sanctions to compel you to be a serious, committed Jew, to compel you to live by the Jewish lifestyle, to be a loyal member of the community. In 1996, there are no sanctions, and we have been looking for a rationale ever since. Why should one be seriously Jewish if you don't have to? We came up with all sorts of answers. Some said, it's our mission to be exemplars of ethical monotheism. We should be Jewish in order to teach the world how to be decent people. Some said, be Jewish as an example of group solidarity. People need community. This is your community, be part of it. My own answer, and the last time I was at this Y, I talked about my book To Life, and I said the reason to be Jewish is that there is a fundamental human need for significance. Just as human beings have a need for food and exercise and sleep, human beings have a need for significance. We need to know that our lives matter. I am convinced people are not afraid of dying. People are afraid of not having lived. People are afraid they will have lived their whole lives and never figured out how to get it right. In my 30 years as a rabbi, I sat at the bedside of too many people who were dying. I prayed with too many people at night who would be undergoing life or death emergency surgery the next morning. What they taught me is people who felt they had lived well could handle the prospect of dying. They didn't want to. They wanted to live long enough to see the next grandchild born, the next wedding, the next family occasion. But if their time was up, they could take it. People who panicked at the thought of death, people who could not handle it, were people who felt they had never really gotten around to doing anything in their life. And if God would give them another 2 or 3 years, maybe they could finally get it right. There is a desperate human hunger to know that our lives mean something, and religion answers that need. Through the creation of holiness, through the investment of categories of permitted and forbidden in everything we do, we invest even the most insignificant, the most ordinary moments of our lives with something eternal. We know that our lives matter. This, it seems to me, is a modern rationale for taking one's Jewishness seriously, because it solves the human problem. How do I do something significant with my life? How do I teach my life to transcend the minimal level of getting up in the morning and going to work and paying my bills and getting older every year? Religion answers that need. Judaism answers as well as any religion I know. One of the major manifestations of this new freedom, of the voluntarism, the community of consent rather than a community of dissent, is the problem of intermarriage. And anyone who looks at the status of world Jewry today has to focus on this as one of the grave causes of concern. We are losing numbers, we are eroding our communities, and we're losing morale. What are we to do about it? I've been going around the country for the last couple of years insisting that the most important thing the Jewish community in America has to do as we prepare for the millennium is to learn to see intermarriage as a doorway that leads into Judaism, not a doorway that leads out. There may have been a time, a generation or 2 generations ago, where the Jew who married a non-Jew was looking to escape from Judaism, because Judaism was embarrassing, it was limiting, it was declass, it wasn't attractive, it wasn't in. That no longer obtains. One of the problems we have, one of the reasons for the 52% rate of Jewish interfaith marriage is that it is so popular to marry Jews today. It's in. And we are reaping the consequences of our acceptance. For a generation or 2, Jews have been saying, as we move to suburbia, don't be afraid of us, we're just like you. And you know what? They listened. They listened and they believed us. And all that exclusion and all that rejection and all that anti-Semitism, which limited the possibilities for intermarriage in an earlier age, doesn't exist anymore. What are we going to do about it? I think we have to learn to see intermarriage as an opportunity to bring a lot of people into the Jewish fold. There is a tremendous groundswell of interest, fascination, even affection for being Jewish. Much of it among Gentiles more than among Jews. I mean, your typical intermarriage is a Jewish guy running away from Jewish identity and a non-Jewish woman attracted to it. No wonder they meet. They're on a collision course. Last November, in the days following the Rabin assassination, I responded to that news as I suspect many of you did. I obsessed about it. I needed to stay tuned in to CNN. I wanted to hear as much about it as possible. For 3 days, I kept watching television. And then by, I guess it was Tuesday morning or Monday morning, the morning of the funeral, I was watching it on the Today Show, and something occurred to me. It suddenly flashed on my mind, you know, NBC doesn't program specially for Harold Kushner. All of America is watching this. All of America is watching the Today Show preempted by the Rabin funeral. And all of CNN for the whole country was about nothing except the Rabin assassination for 48 hours. Not just for me, and not just for the Jewish viewers. All of America was fascinated with what was going on in Israel. We didn't do it when Charles de Gaulle died. We didn't do it when Indira Gandhi was assassinated. There is something about Israel that has a special appeal to the American soul. I think to some degree the reception of my books by non-Jewish America says something about the readiness of American Christians, American Gentiles, to learn about life and faith from a rabbi. and the several dozen people whom I have guided to become Jewish when they were not born Jews, I would guide them through a year of study, and when the year of study was almost over, I would sit down with them and I would say, okay, of everything you have learned, of everything you have seen, of everything you have experienced, what has impressed you the most about the prospect of being Jewish? And you know something? They all gave me the same answer. Older and younger candidates, graduates of Catholic parochial schools and third-generation atheists, they all told me the same thing. The first was the warmth and closeness of the Jewish family. We're trying to get out from under our parents. They wish they had a mother who said, put on a sweater, it's cold out. Because they correctly perceive it as being love and concern and not nagging. They wish they had families like that. They wish they were part of communities where people really cared about each other, cared enough to shout and cry and argue and slam doors if necessary, but cared. And the second thing they all told me was the intellectual openness of the Jewish tradition. There's nothing you have to pretend to believe in order to be Jewish. One after another, they told me the story when they were 15 years old, going in to see the priest, going in to see the minister, saying, you know, I'm not sure I believe what we're supposed to believe. And the answer was, really? Go home and work on your faith. And they talk about going to see the rabbi and saying, you know, that chapter we read for this week, I'm not sure I go along with that. And the rabbi would say, yeah, I'm not sure I go along with it either. And they love that. Not the uncertainty, they love the honesty, the lack of intellectual pretense and hypocrisy. There are people out there, some of whom are involved in interfaith marriages, not just because they love a Jewish guy, but because at some level they love Judaism. And the most important thing we can do, if we are to keep intermarriage from being a numerical and qualitative drain on the Jewish community, the most important thing we can do is make it as easy as possible for these people to become Jewish. Why don't we do it? Why do we find it so hard, so unnatural? I think there are two reasons. The first is, for a lot of Jews who really care about the Jewish future, we tend viscerally, emotionally, we tend to see the intermarried couple as the enemy, as the traitor. We send off signals of rejection, and they are so tuned in to any possibility of rejection that they pick up signals even if we don't realize we're sending them. Let me tell you two stories. The first really has nothing to do with the subject, but it'll make the point in a roundabout way. A couple of years ago, I read a book by a psychiatrist named Irving Yalom about some of his experiences that he's learned from cases he's dealt with. And what I admired about the book is, unlike most people who write books, Dr. Yalom doesn't talk about how bright he is. He talks about what he learned from his mistakes. He tells one story of being contacted by a hospital where he was affiliated to participate in caring for a woman who'd been admitted to the hospital for gross obesity. She weighed well over 300 pounds. She was going to go on a diet and exercise regimen, sort of like the cardio court here, with the mirrors that make you look thin. And they wanted Dr. Yalom to work on the psychological aspects of her compulsive overeating. Dr. Yalom reports that when he was asked to take on this case, the first thing he says to himself is, if I'm going to do this, I have to get over my dislike of very fat women. I don't like fat women. They turn me off. But he says, now, wait a minute. They're not asking me to date her. They're not asking me to have a social relationship with her. They're asking me to work with her on her emotional problems. Yeah, that's what I do. I do that for a living. I can do this. So he takes on the case. He meets with the woman twice a week for a year. Over the course of that year, the diet, the exercise, the therapy all work. The woman loses over 100 pounds. She's ready to leave the hospital and pick up a normal life again. Dr. Yalom schedules a termination session with her. He says to her, I'm very proud of you. You've done wonderfully. You've achieved so much. Please don't think that this is the last time we'll ever speak. Anytime you need a booster shot, give me a call. I'll be available for you. Is there anything you want to say to me before we separate? And he assumes that she will say what so many of his clients say, what a wonderful therapist he's been and how lucky she's been to have been in his care. But she surprises him. She says, yes, doctor, there is something I want to say. I've seen you for 100 hours, twice a week for a year. In those 100 hours, you've never touched me. I've seen you with other patients. You shake hands when they come in. You pat them on the back when they leave. You hug them after a breakthrough. You've never done that with me, and I just want to tell you I was aware of it and it made me feel bad. Do you see what happened? Do you see what was going on? The psychiatrist was so sure that he was being absolutely professional. He was hiding his personal feelings of revulsion at this obese woman. But she was so sensitive to signs of rejection from men because it had happened to her so often, she picked up signals he didn't know he was sending out. I think too often we do that with people who, with great trepidation, step over the threshold of the synagogue or the Jewish community center. Our negative feelings about intermarriage somehow get across to them, and because they come in so uncertain as to how welcome they will be, they pick up those negative signs much more sensitively than we realize we're sending them out. Second story to make that point. A couple of years ago, I was invited to speak at a synagogue in Bangor, Maine. It was their centennial, and they had a lecture series. And at the dinner that the leaders of the congregation took me to before my talk, they told me a story that had happened under the administration of a previous rabbi some 40 years ago. There was a family in the congregation who had a 12-and-a-half-year-old son who was studying for his bar mitzvah. He was a bright, gifted student. He loved Hebrew school. He ate it up. And he was going to really be a star at his bar mitzvah. 2 months before the bar mitzvah, the rabbi calls the parents in and talks to them about the service and says, will there be any grandparents there that we can ask to pass the Torah down from generation to generation? And the husband, Mr. Cohen, says, well, I'm afraid not. My parents are deceased and my wife's parents aren't Jewish. The rabbi turns to Mrs. Cohen and says, oh, are you a convert? And she says, no, I'm a Methodist. Was your child converted? No, we just decided the name is Cohen. We would raise him Jewishly. I mean, my husband cares more about this than I do. The rabbi says to them, you know, according to Jewish law, your child is not Jewish. There's no bar mitzvah. The parents say, but he's looking forward to it. All his friends have become bar mitzvah. He's studying. He loves it. He's such a good student. The rabbi says, you're perpetrating a fraud on the synagogue. We don't run ceremonies for Gentile children. No bar mitzvah. Mr. Cohen says, wait a minute. I'm not perpetrating any fraud. When I signed up to be a member 6 years ago, nobody asked about whether my wife and kid were Jewish. They just told me how much to make the checkout for. I think you're being unreasonable. The rabbi says, I'm very sorry. We make a distinction between Jews and Gentiles in this congregation. No bar mitzvah. Enraged, humiliated, hurt, the parents quit the synagogue and joined the Unitarian Church. And that 12-and-a-half-year-old boy grew up to be Senator William Cohen. And what might it have meant for the Jewish community had they found a way, and there were plenty of ways, of taking this young man who wanted to study in Hebrew school and finding a way to let him study. But if we are so intimidated, if we are so negatively responding to every case of interfaith marriage instead of seeing it as an opportunity, it never occurs to us to do that. That's one reason. I think it is the lesser reason. The major reason why we find it so hard to reach out and welcome the prospective convert is that there's a part of us that really can't understand why somebody would be Jewish if she didn't have to. Because we're not sure we would be Jewish if we didn't have to. Let me prove this to you in a very interesting way. Gentile women are raised to believe that Jewish men make the best husbands. They earn a good living, they treat you right, they don't drink and gamble, they don't beat you up, they care about the children, they help with the dishes. Boy, will you be lucky if you can find a Jewish husband. Jewish women are raised to believe that Jewish men are wimps. You know, how do we know Jesus was really Jewish? Because he was 30 years old, unmarried, and his mother thought he was God. Non-Jewish men are raised to believe that Jewish women are sexy and exotic and desirable. Jewish men are raised to believe that Jewish women are Japs. You know, the story of the Jewish mother who had it in her will that when she died, she wanted to be cremated and her ashes sprinkled at Bloomingdale so her daughter would visit her grave every week. Why do we perpetuate these misleading myths about each other? Because there's a part of us that's really kind of negative about being Jewish. Because there's a part of us that sees Jewish as something bad, something limiting, something unattractive. And we project it onto other Jews. And we make it harder for Jewish girls to see Jewish men in a positive light, and harder for Jewish men to find Jewish women attractive. When you add that to the sheer mathematics that 97+% of the people out there are Gentile, you make it very hard to come up with a Jewish marriage. I think the most important thing we have to do is for Jews to begin to think that being Jewish is the most wonderful thing that could happen to a person. Being Jewish is the most wonderful thing that can happen to a person. Start thinking like that, and there will be fewer interfaith relationships, and more of those that do happen, because as somebody said, the real matchmaker today is the university director of admissions. When there are interfaith relationships, more of them will result in people coming into the community than in people leaving. And any rabbi you talk to, I think, will endorse what I'm going to tell you now. When it comes to conversions into and out of Judaism, our imports are better quality than our exports. I look at everything that's right in Judaism today and everything that's not so right. And if I could change one thing, if I could fasten on one thing that we could do better, I think my choice might surprise some of you. You know what it would be? I would like American Jews to learn Hebrew. One thing that would make us a different kind of Jewish community, that would be at the very top of my list. For a whole lot of reasons. Because if you learn Hebrew, the Torah and the Siddur are open books to you, instead of just a lot of funny letters with a translation that's very confusing. I do a lot of lecturing on the question of when bad things happen to good people. I was speaking on that in Boston last night, as a matter of fact. And when I speak on that topic, I make a little bet with the sponsors of my lecture. I say to them, let me predict in advance what one of the first 5 questions will be. It's going to be somebody saying, Rabbi Kushner, what you've said, doesn't that contradict what we say on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? That it's decided on Rosh Hashanah, confirmed on Yom Kippur, who shall live and who shall die, who shall prosper and who shall suffer. Doesn't that go against your theology? And somebody always asks the question, and my answer to it is yes, it contradicts my theology, but in my synagogue in Natick, we say that in Hebrew, so nobody will understand it. I would love to be a rabbi of a congregation where people understood it, so we could have a serious conversation about things like that, rather than just have them sort of left cold by the Hebrew and confused by the English translation. More than that, there are values in a language. And the more foreign languages I become acquainted with, the more I learn that your mentality is shaped by the inner soul of the language. Our daughter is married to a young man from South America, and as a result, I've been learning Spanish. I've been working at it for a couple of years. It's doing it slowly at my age. I'm at the point now where my Spanish is just good enough that it's affecting real estate in our neighborhood. But one of the things I've learned is that in Spanish, there are 2 forms of the verb to be, ser and estar. One for permanent being and one for temporary being. And I find that fascinating, that it just, when you grow up with this nuance, with these options, you think about things in different terms. Is this a permanent condition or a temporary condition? And that conditions your mind. There are similar values when you speak Hebrew. For example, there is no such verb in Hebrew meaning to enter. It exists only in the passive form, lehikanes, to be welcomed in. And the language, the grammar, conveys the idea that you can never go into somebody else's home. The master of the house can only invite you in. You can't enter. The idea that tzedakah in Hebrew is a very different concept from charity in English. that when you translate tefillin as phylacteries, not only have you not explained anything, because phylacteries is at least as far in a word as tefillin, but you have contaminated the meaning of it, because phylactery comes from a Greek root meaning to protect, to guard. Phylacteries are a totem. They're something you put on for good luck. Tefillin means prayer objects. No sense that you're putting them on to ward off evil spirits. You're putting them on to get you in the mood for prayer. There are all sorts of connections. One of the wonderful things about Hebrew is it has such a limited stock of words. So many words are related. One could spend an hour talking about the nuances of the word kadosh, meaning holy, from the kiddush after services to kiddush Hashem as martyrdom, to all sorts of the mourner's kaddish, how all of these fit together because they are etymologically related in a way that they're not related in their English translation. Teach people Hebrew, and all of a sudden, these unique Jewish concepts are communicated along with the vocabulary and the grammar. And then there are values in a shared language. When I go to a country where I can speak the language, I don't have to spend all of my time in the local Hilton talking to other Americans and to people who deal with tourists. I can savor the language. To share Hebrew with other Jews all over the world. When our daughter started dating this young man from South America, they found that one of the ways they could communicate, because she knew no Spanish and he knew only a little English, and if they wanted to keep secrets from the roommates around them, they would speak in Hebrew, because they're both graduates of day schools. And it gave them not only a means of communication, it gave them a sense that they had something very important in common. We would be a very different people if we were a people that knew Hebrew. The world Jewish scene would be a different scene. The concern about are we still one people, the ability of Israeli and American Jews to relate to each other would be radically different if we were a community that knew Hebrew. I go back to my opening remarks. How can I be optimistic with everything that is going wrong on the American scene today? With all the shallowness and the vulgarity, the distractions, the assimilation, how can I be optimistic? I'm optimistic because I believe that a culture, like an individual, has an almost biological drive to survive. And that cultures will do what they have to do, will adopt in whatever way they have to adopt to remain viable. I'm optimistic because I believe every human being has a fundamental need for a spiritual dimension in his or her life, for something that goes beyond the rational. At the beginning of the 20th century, liberal American Jews looked at the Jewish tradition and threw out everything that didn't make sense. Dietary laws, Sabbath, circumcision, Hebrew. I once compared that to lifting the hood of my car and throwing away everything the function of which I didn't understand. And so at the end of the 20th century, we've gone back and started putting those things back. We are discovering there is a hunger for not the irrational, but the non-rational, the trans-rational, the mystical. When I was a rabbinical student on the other side of town at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the 1950s, we were absolutely convinced that by the end of the 20th century, there would be no more Orthodox Jews left in America. Because by the end of the 20th century, the American Jewish community would be entirely native-born and college-graduated, and in 1950s, everybody knew that native-born college-graduate Jews would not be Orthodox. Now it's 1996, and you see the strength of Chabad, and you see the strength of the Orthodox community and the Baalei Tshuva, and there are more kosher restaurants in Manhattan now than there were when I was a student here. And we were wrong. And the reason we were wrong is that we assumed that when it comes to spiritual life, people would be rational and would have no patience for things that don't make sense. The truth is, people have a need for things that don't make sense. Falling in love doesn't make sense. Becoming a parent doesn't make sense. Giving charity doesn't make sense. But they make human sense. Our lives would not be completely human without all these things. I had occasion recently, I was speaking to the Jewish community in Puerto Rico, to talk about raising children to be Jewishly loyal. Somebody asked me the question. She said, how do I teach my 9-year-old son to believe in God? And I said, you can't. It's the wrong question. I said, first of all, you can't teach anybody, especially a 9-year-old, to believe in God. That's not how somebody comes to believe in God. But besides, what you really should be asking is not how do I teach him to believe in God? How do I teach him to recognize God? How do I teach my child to recognize all those occasions in his life where he has met God? And I said to this group of young parents in Puerto Rico, children have a need for magic. They have a need for mystery. They have a need for specialness. And you are depriving your children. You are mistreating your children if you don't make room in their lives for magic and wonder and all of these things. Shabbat candles, Hanukkah candles, take them to synagogue, hold them up to kiss the Torah, expose them to these things. There is a human need. For 2 generations, we didn't meet that need, and you know what happened? Our children went off and became Buddhists and joined the Unification Church. And we couldn't understand why. We gave them such a rational, sensible education. No superstition, nothing irrational. And there was a part of their soul we were not reaching, and they went looking for it someplace else. I believe there is in every human soul a need for religious expression. And sooner or later that need will come out. As we saw with the young Israelis after the Rabin assassination, as we've seen with young American Jews not going to the Unification Church but being attracted to Chabad, and for all of my theological differences with Chabad, I don't have to tell you I would rather see young Jews going there than going some of the other places. I have seen it in, I can't tell you how many large Reform temples I've spoken at in the south and in the west of this country, where a beloved old rabbi has retired after 40 years, and his successor comes out of Cincinnati wearing a kippah and growing a beard and playing a guitar and bringing all sorts of elements into this Reform congregation, which causes the 75-year-old ladies to say, I thought we didn't do that, we're Reform, but everybody below that age is just wild about it. There is a human need for the spiritual. More than that, there is a human need for community. I took a course when I was at Columbia in anthropology, and I remember one sentence. It was a bad course, but one sentence I remember. We read a book by an anthropologist who studied chimpanzees, and one line in the book said, one chimpanzee can't be a chimpanzee. He can only be a chimp in the company of other chimps. And one human being can't be a human being. And one Jew can't be a Jew. You can only be a Jew as a member of a Jewish community. You can only be a Jew with other Jews. There is a passage we will read in a couple of weeks when we come to the story of the golden calf in the Torah. You remember what happens? The Israelites, Moses is up on the mountain for 40 days. The Israelites grow a little panicky. They say to Aaron, make us a statue of God that we can worship and give thanks to. Aaron makes a golden calf. God is absolutely incensed. It's like finding out that your wife has betrayed you on your honeymoon. He can't turn his back on these people for a month. He says to Moses, I'm going to destroy the whole people. I'm going to start over with you. I did it with Adam. I did it with Noah. I did it with Abraham. I can start over with you. You'll be the ancestor of a new people. And Moses says, no, I don't want to survive without my community. I don't want to live in a world where there is no Jewish people. And finally, he persuades God to relent and forgive Israel for the sin of the golden calf. There's a great deal of apathy and a great deal of ignorance and a whole lot of distraction and assimilation. But I suspect at bedrock level, American Jews would say what Moses said. I really don't want to live in a world where there is no Jewish people. We are children of the 20th century, the century that taught us to be individuals and to put our own personal fulfillment ahead of everything else. And as the 20th century is about to draw to a close, we are finding out that that individualist ethos simply does not work. If everybody looks out for himself, we live in a cold and friendless world. As we need the spiritual dimension, we need the communal dimension. We cannot be human by ourselves. We cannot be religious by ourselves. We don't want to live in a world from which the Jewish people has disappeared. I know all the problems of the Jewish present and the Jewish future. I have lived with them. I have knocked myself out trying to do something about them for 30 years. Been very frustrated at times, and yet at bottom, I remain an optimist. That as we have at other times when the Jewish story could have ended and didn't, because it said something to the soul of the individual Jew, things will happen as we turn the millennium. And on the other side of the year 2000, and I pray for many years afterwards, there will be a vibrant Jewish community here and in Israel, connected to each other, communicating with each other, sharing with each other, together questing for God. Because when we join in that quest together, something happens which would not happen if we searched alone. That which we are questing for, we will find. Thank you very much. We got some really interesting questions here. Let me try and take some of the most germane ones. Do you believe the Jews are the chosen people? If what you mean is, are Jews better than anybody else? Listen, I was a congregational rabbi for 30 years. One thing I know beyond any quibbling is Jews are no better than anybody else. But that's not the answer to the question. I take the claim that we are a chosen people not as an assertion of Jewish superiority, biological or spiritual or any other kind of superiority. I take it as an unarguable statement of historical fact. The claim that the Jews are a chosen people is a historical fact. It was through the Jews, nobody else, that the idea of monotheism, of a God who demands righteousness, came to the world. It was the Jews and nobody else who gave the world the Bible, the Ten Commandments, the prophets, the Psalms. I don't know why. The Torah in the book of Devarim and Deuteronomy makes it very clear. God is pictured as saying specifically in the Torah, it's not because you are better, it's simply because I chose you. That is, God chose us to be his vehicle of self-revelation to the world, not because we deserved it, but simply because we were there and we were the ones God chose. The implication is, if this is a historical fact in our past, that's a very honorable thing to live up to. A couple of years ago, it was a year and a half ago, at high holiday services of my congregation, I was commenting on the Rosh Hashanah prayer, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. And I said, you know, if you speak about one's father as being the king, that means that you are a member of the royal family, and there are ways in which members of the royal family should behave. Then I stopped and realized the way members of the royal family behave these days, and decided maybe that wasn't the best metaphor. But when you start with the undeniable historical fact that the Jewish people were the vehicle through which the Word and the idea of God came to the world, that's something to be very proud of. It doesn't make us better, doesn't make us smarter, but it does make us prouder. And I think if you take pride in who your forefathers were, who your ancestors were, I think that affects the way you live. See what else we got there. Do you think that in 2 or 3 generations, only Orthodox and non-affiliated Jews will be left? No. You want me to elaborate on that? My guess is, I've already been surprised once that the Orthodox are still around. My guess is that the Baal Teshuvah movement and the fascination with a return to orthodoxy, if it hasn't peaked, will be peaking very soon and will not continue to grow. Because as I study human history, it seems clear to me that the story of the human society is the progress from obedience to autonomy. Whether you're talking about the family or politics or religion, we see a pattern, almost an iron law, that people start out with somebody else making the decisions for them, and little by little they claim the decision-making process for themselves. And I think it's going to happen in Jewish religion. I think there are reasons, temporary reasons, owing to the 1996 situation, why Orthodoxy and Christian fundamentalism and Muslim fundamentalism, it's not just, if it was only Orthodoxy, the Orthodox would have a very simple answer. We're right and people are finally realizing it. When you see the same thing happening in Christianity and in Islam and in politics, you begin to think it's a zeitgeist. Something is going on in the world that is making people more fundamentalist. Part of it, I suspect, is simply the rapid rate of change, and you want something to hold on to. Part of it, I think, is a response to the vulgarity of American life and of contemporary Western culture. You look at America's movies, music, magazines, television, and it's very tempting to say, if this is what American secular life is, I'm not sure I want it. Maybe I will retreat into the Orthodox world, the fundamentalist Christian world. You know what it's like? Some of you will remember the freedom rides of the 1960s. Blacks sitting in at lunch counters at Woolworths in North Carolina, insisting that they be served just like any other customer. And it worked. Woolworths agreed to serve them, and after they won, they looked at each other and said, hey, this is great, but who wants to have lunch at Woolworths? For 2 generations, the leaders of the American Jewish community insisted on the right to be like other Americans, to live where our Gentile neighbors live without restrictive covenants, to work where our Gentile neighbors are able to get jobs. We should be able to get jobs on our merit at the same places, to go to the same schools they went to be represented in Congress as equally as they are. And when we got all these things, we looked around at what does it mean to live in the suburbs, and what does it mean to have these jobs and to go to these schools? I'm not sure we want to have lunch at Woolworths. I'm not sure we want to be integrated into this kind of society. There was a family in my congregation in Natick who moved to New York City because the husband got a better job, came back a year later for the bar mitzvah of the son of some close friends of theirs, and I asked how they're getting along, and they told me they had moved to Borough Park and joined an Orthodox congregation. And I said to the wife, Joan, I can't believe it. You were a feminist. You insisted on equal rights for women. How can you daven in a shul where they make you sit upstairs behind a curtain? And she said to me, well, it took some getting used to. But in the frum world, men don't make off-color jokes to embarrass me, and men don't brush against me in inappropriate ways, and my best friend's husband doesn't make a pass at me, all of which happened when we were liberal Jews. And there are certain things I'm willing to trade off to live in that kind of a world. I think some of the appeal of Jewish orthodoxy and Christian fundamentalism is a reaction against the shallowness and the mendacity of American secular pagan life. But ultimately, I suspect, having gained the benefits, people will reclaim for themselves the right to make decisions about their own lives. Here's one I suspect one person asked, but a lot of people might be concerned about. How do Jewish parents and grandparents handle the Christmas tree in the home situation when their daughter-in-law who converted to Judaism wants to relive her happy Christmas childhood memories? In a case where the parent of non-Jewish origin has converted, so that you have a Jewish home with 2 Jewish parents in it, I think somebody, whoever, in-laws, rabbi, neighbor, somebody, husband, should say, there are certain things you give up when you become Jewish in exchange for all the wonderful things you gain. You want to relive your happy Christmas childhood memories, go to your parents' house, where it is totally appropriate for them to have a tree, and totally appropriate for our kids to go there and see their Christian grandparents celebrate Christmas. Your parents live in San Diego, go to a Christian neighbor's house, where it's appropriate for them to have a tree, and appropriate for our Jewish children to see what a Christian home looks like at Christmas. But ours is a Jewish home. The tricky part is when the non-Jewish parent has not converted, And what you got to do at that time is negotiate it. I very strongly believe that the wrongest thing you can do in an interfaith marriage is raise children in two religions simultaneously. I think that's worse than raising them in no religion, and I think raising them in no religion is very bad. Because for young children, religion is more a matter of identity and less a matter of theology. Kids have to know who they are. Kids have to know what box they check off. Who do they belong to? How do they define themselves? You have no right to confuse children as to what their identity is. But I also believe it is very important for children of an intermarriage to know that they may be Jewish, but they have a Christian parent and Christian grandparents, and this is what the holidays are like in their tradition, and this is part of their heritage. And I certainly think that if the children are being raised Jewishly, they should go to their grandparents' house for Christmas and Easter. And if they're being raised as Christians, and I have said to members of my congregation marrying someone who is Christian, I have said I would rather see you raise your children as Christians, if that is the stronger gravitational pull, than raise them with no religion or with two religions. If they're being raised as Christians, then they should definitely go to the Jewish grandparents for Sukkot and for Hanukkah and for the Pesach Seder. Let them know that this is their religion, but that they are the offspring of a family where two traditions are observed. But if it's a Jewish home, Christmas tree has no place in it. Definitely Christmas tree at the grandparents' home, definitely not in the Jewish home. Here's one. With all the wealth in the American Jewish community, why do you think Hebrew school is still not free for everyone? I've often wondered about that. We tried to do it in my congregation in Natick. We tried to set up an endowment fund which would mean that the synagogue operating budget would be entirely covered by dues and there'd be no Hebrew school tradition. And we were shot down. Why were we shut down? To my major embarrassment, because it was my idea, because more than half the members of the congregation said, I paid for my kids' Hebrew school, I'm not going to pay for somebody else's kids' Hebrew school. Fortunately, it's not only a Jewish affliction, because the Christians in Natick say the same thing about the public schools. Don't raise the real estate taxes. I paid for my kids going to school. Now that my kids are off in college or my kids are grown, I should not have to pay for somebody else's kids. It's what's happened in America. It is the sense of atomization of society, of everybody trying to figure out what he wants for himself. In a community near mine in the suburbs of Boston, people did something very clever. They decided to lower their taxes by doing away with trash collection. The community, the municipality will not pick up garbage, arrange for it yourself. The result was everybody had to contract for private trash collection. It cost them 50% more than it would have had it been done by the municipality, and they were happy to pay for it because they would rather spend the money themselves than give it to the government. It is the result of the brainwashing we have received over the last several years. It is a result of the endemic selfishness, which is one of the negative aspects of the American, not the American Jewish, but the American personality, the frontier mentality, and a whole lot of other things. We simply don't understand that sometimes it is the better part of wisdom to pool our resources and enrich the lives of the entire community. We'd rather keep the money for ourselves. It's not only Hebrew schools. How many people, don't raise your hands, this is a rhetorical question. How many people seated in this audience tonight are paying for security in your community or your apartment building rather than spend less money to make the dangers of urban crime less real, less of a threat? How many of us are spending money to take cabs and to send mail by Federal Express rather than contribute with all of our neighbors to make the subway safer and to make the mails better for everybody? We think automatically in terms of solving our own problems and leaving our neighbors to solve theirs. If I'm permitted to dream, one of my dreams might be that the Jews of the United States would teach their non-Jewish neighbors something about the value of community. That we would give our neighbors an example of what it's like to take responsibility for other people. Tear down those posters from the dormitory walls with that absolutely inane, mindless, worthless quotation from Fritz Perls, "I'm here for myself and you're here for yourself and I'm not here to solve your problems and you're not here to solve my problems." Utter stupidity. We are here to solve each other's problems because there are problems I cannot solve for myself and there are problems you cannot solve for yourself. And I grew up in a neighborhood in Crown Heights in Brooklyn where if my mother wasn't home, somebody else's mother would watch out for me. And my mother would do it for their kids. And it was a much healthier community when we cared for each other. There is something intrinsically, traditionally Jewish about that. We express it in the idea of the minyan, that you can't find God by yourself. We express it with our ideas of tzedakah, that this is not a gift, this is the Jewish tax collector. Be that kind of community. To a degree we are. We do subsidize through Federation the day schools, and we do reach out to the poor and ask others to pick up the difference, but we do it imperfectly because we are still somewhat contaminated by this individualist American mentality. Let the Jewish communities in this country be real Jewish communities. Let them rediscover what Judaism is about, and let the rest of the United States learn from us what it means to be a completely realized human being. And let's take that as our closing benediction. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.